Being a food service manager isn't easy. You've got responsibilities to your operation, to your staff, and to your guests. Taking time to keep food safe is one of those things that we just can't set aside. First up, let's take a look at the basics of providing safe food. We'll start at the beginning and take a look at what foodborne illness actually is, and then we'll see how foodborne illness occurs. And once we understand that, we'll talk about what you can do to keep food safe. I'm guessing you already know that keeping our guests safe from foodborne illness means paying attention to the details. Well, here's what can happen if something slips through the cracks.
Dozens of people became sick at a small cafe. Guests who ate the cafe's famous baked potato salad called to complain of nausea and vomiting. These calls began within 2 days after eating the dish. Guests eventually experienced double vision and difficulty in speaking and swallowing. The local regulatory authorities investigated, and they found that the baked potatoes in the salad were the source of the outbreak. The potatoes had been wrapped in aluminum foil when they were baked. Then they were left on a prep table overnight to cool. Ultimately, the potatoes were left at room temperature for almost 18 hours before they were used in the salad. Bacteria on the potatoes had the correct conditions for growth.
Who knew that something as simple as leaving some baked potatoes out could cause so much misery for so many? Well, we're here to make sure that nothing like this will happen to you, your staff, or your guests. The cost of a foodborne illness can be devastating in more ways than one. Okay, let's see what you already know about food safety. True or false? A foodborne illness is a disease transmitted to people through food. You're absolutely right. A foodborne illness is a disease that's transmitted to people through food, and every year millions of people get sick from unsafe food. You've probably heard the term outbreak tossed around, but how is an outbreak confirmed? A few things have to happen. First, 2 or more people need to have the same symptoms after eating the same food. After that, an investigation is conducted by state and local regulatory authorities. And then the outbreak has to be confirmed by a laboratory analysis. If all of those things line up, that's a confirmed foodborne illness outbreak. No operation wants to be responsible for foodborne illness. The good news is that food service operations and restaurants have been working hard to reduce these outbreaks, and it's working. Foodborne illness occurrences have declined in recent years. But that doesn't mean it's been easy. There are a lot of challenges to food safety. First off, time. We're busy, and pressure to work fast can make it hard to take the time to follow important food safety practices. And language and culture can be a problem too. Like, what if your staff speaks a different language than you? That could make it hard to communicate. Plus, cultural differences can also influence how food handlers, your staff, view food safety. Also, there may be an issue with literacy and education. It's not uncommon for the staff in one operation to have a wide range of education levels, and that can lead to some challenges when you teach food safety. And how about pathogens, those disease-causing microorganisms like bacteria and viruses that can result in foodborne illness? They're turning up more frequently on food that used to be considered safe. Not too long ago, nobody worried much about E. coli on salad greens, but now it can be a problem. Unapproved suppliers are another risk. If your operation receives food from suppliers who aren't practicing food safety, that could cause a foodborne illness outbreak, even if your staff do everything else correctly. And even customers can pose a challenge to food safety. The number of customers who are at a high risk for getting a foodborne illness is increasing. Our increasing elderly population is one example of this. And of course, every operation has to deal with some level of staff turnover, and training new staff may not leave a lot of time for food safety training. Okay, so there are a lot of challenges. Don't worry. We'll show you how to keep your guests and your operations safe. And that's important because managers and owner-operators who don't do their part can run into some real trouble.
Foodborne illnesses cost the United States billions of dollars each year. And National Restaurant Association figures show that just one foodborne illness outbreak can cost an operation thousands of dollars and even shut it down. The cost to the operation can be high. It could lose customers, sales, and reputation. Negative media exposure isn't good for any operation. On the finance side, there are potentials for lawsuits, legal fees, and increased insurance premiums. And it's hard on the staff, too. Morale goes down, staff may miss work, and there will probably have to be staff retraining to address food safety concerns. But the most important costs are the human costs. Because victims of foodborne illness may have to deal with lost work, medical costs, long-term disability, and even death.
All right, that's all pretty serious stuff. But the good news is that preventing foodborne illness isn't impossible. A lot of it is just common sense and paying attention to what's going on in your operation. So now that we understand the impacts of foodborne illness, let's talk about what causes it and how you can prevent it. Question time. What is the usual cause of unsafe food? Yep, you got it. It's contamination, which is the presence of harmful substances in food. Contaminants are divided into three categories: biological, chemical, and physical. We'll start with biological. Pathogens are the greatest threats to food safety. So what's a pathogen? Well, some viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi are pathogens. But there are also some other biological contaminants that you'll need to look out for. Because some plants, mushrooms, and seafood that carry toxins or poisons are also included in this group. Some chemicals are also a threat. Food service chemicals can contaminate food if they're used incorrectly. So cleaners, sanitizers, and polishes are all possible threats to food safety if staff don't know how to use them correctly. And last, we've got those physical contaminants. Some broken glass in your drink can wreck your day in a hurry. Other examples of physical contaminants include things like metal shavings, staples, bandages, gross, even dirt and bag ties. And naturally occurring objects can be a hazard too, like fish bones and fillets. Now, biological, chemical, and physical contaminants are all dangerous to food safety. But do you want to guess which one is responsible for most foodborne illness? It's biological contamination. If staff don't know how to handle food correctly, it can become unsafe, and no one wants that. When it comes down to it, there are 5 main risks to food safety.
One important risk to food safety is purchasing food from unsafe sources. Food safety starts with keeping unsafe food out of the operation in the first place. And keep in mind that food prepared in a private home is considered to be from an unsafe source and must be avoided. Once food is in the operation, things like failing to cook it the right way or holding it at the wrong temperature are also risks to food safety. And so are using contaminated equipment and practicing poor personal hygiene. Now, except for purchasing food from unsafe sources, these mistakes are all related to 4 main factors. Those 4 factors are time temperature control, cross-contamination, poor personal hygiene, and cleaning and sanitizing. Okay, here's a question. Let's say you find a pan of macaroni salad that's been left sitting out on a prep table for 5 hours. Which hazard do you think this is? You got it. This is an example of time temperature abuse.
Food has been time temperature abused when it has stayed too long at temperatures that are good for the growth of pathogens. It's probably no surprise to learn that a foodborne illness can result if food is time temperature abused. It can happen lots of ways. Like if food isn't held or stored at the right temperature. And if food isn't cooked or reheated enough to kill pathogens, that's time temperature abuse as well. And this last one sometimes surprises people, but even failing to cool food down correctly can result in time temperature abuse.
Next question. Let's say a food handler uses the same cutting board for raw chicken and lettuce. Which hazard is this? Bingo. This is an example of cross-contamination. When pathogens transfer from one surface or food to another, that's cross-contamination. It can cause a foodborne illness, and there are a few different ways it can happen.
For example, cross-contamination happens when contaminated ingredients are added to food that receives no further cooking. Or it can happen when ready-to-eat food touches contaminated surfaces, or when contaminated food touches or drips onto cooked or ready-to-eat food. Gross. Cross-contamination can also happen when a food handler touches contaminated food and then touches ready-to-eat food, or when contaminated cleaning cloths touch food contact surfaces. Any one of these things can result in cross-contamination. So what exactly do we mean when we say poor personal hygiene? Well, poor personal hygiene can cause a foodborne illness in a number of ways. Touching or scratching a wound and then touching food is one example. And so are coughing or sneezing onto food, or even working while sick. And of course, the big one that everyone needs to be aware of, failing to wash hands after using the restroom. That's a classic example of poor personal hygiene. And finally, we've got poor cleaning and sanitizing. Pathogens can spread to food if equipment hasn't been cleaned and sanitized correctly in between uses. So, for example, if equipment and utensils are not washed, rinsed, and sanitized in between uses, that's considered poor cleaning and sanitizing. Same story if food contact surfaces are just wiped down in between uses instead of being washed, rinsed, and sanitized. Even the wiping cloths and sanitizer solutions can cause problems. Examples of that are when wiping cloths aren't stored in sanitizer solution between uses, or if the sanitizing solutions aren't at the right strength. All of these are examples of poor cleaning and sanitizing. And it's up to you to make sure your staff know how to do things correctly. You know some of the ways that pathogens move around and contaminate food. So what happens once they get onto food? Well, it turns out that just like people, pathogens have some favorite food. You probably already know what most of them are.
There are specific types of food that can become unsafe if you don't control time and temperature. There's even a clever acronym, TCS Food. TCS stands for Time and Temperature Control for Safety. Pathogens grow well in these types of food. Now take a look at these two food items. Which one needs time and temperature control to keep it safe? You got it. Easy one, right? Milk and other dairy products are TCS food items. How about this one? Yep, poultry is definitely a TCS food. If you don't maintain good time and temperature control, it can become unsafe. Here's another. Eggs or bread? Exactly. Shell eggs are a TCS food. The only exceptions are shell eggs that have been treated to eliminate the pathogen non-typhoidal salmonella. Okay, one more. That's right. Plant-based food items do not need time and temperature control until they are cooked. This includes things like cooked rice, beans, and vegetables.
Okay, so far we have milk and dairy products, poultry, shell eggs, and heat-treated plant-based food as common TCS food items. All of these need time and temperature control to keep them safe, but there are plenty more TCS food items out there as well. This includes things like meat, including beef, pork, and lamb, and fish, including both shellfish and crustaceans. But that's not all. Believe it or not, baked potatoes are a TCS food, as are tofu and other soy protein and synthetic ingredients like textured soy protein in meat alternatives. Crazy, right? Sliced melons, cut tomatoes, and cut leafy greens also make the list, as do sprouts and sprout seeds. And finally, untreated garlic and oil mixtures close out the list. So that's TCS food. And there's another kind of food that you need to pay special attention to: ready-to-eat food.
Like TCS food, ready-to-eat food also needs careful handling to prevent contamination. Ready-to-eat food is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's food that's ready to be eaten without any further preparation, washing, or cooking. So things like bakery items, cooked food, and deli meat are considered ready-to-eat food. And so are washed fruit and vegetables, both whole and cut. Also, not everyone realizes this at first, but sugar, spices, and seasonings are also ready-to-eat food.
So different kinds of food have different requirements. Got it. But your staff need to know that it's not just food that has different requirements. Different groups of guests may have special requirements as well, because some folks may have a higher risk of getting a foodborne illness. Certain groups of people may have weaker immune systems, and this can put them at a higher risk of getting a foodborne illness. Elderly people are one example. People's immune systems get weaker with age, and the immune system is the body's defense against illness. At the other end of the spectrum, very young children haven't yet built up strong immune systems. And at any age, people can have compromised immune systems. People with cancer or who are on chemotherapy or people with HIV or AIDS may be at a higher risk for foodborne illness. Same story for transplant recipients and people taking certain medications. Their risk for foodborne illness can be increased. All right, you've got an idea of what the dangers to food safety are. Now you can start to think about what you can do to keep food safe in your operation.
To keep your guests safe, focus on controlling time and temperature, preventing cross-contamination, and making sure that your staff are practicing good personal hygiene. Also, look at your operations practices when it comes to purchasing from approved reputable suppliers and cleaning and sanitizing. You'll need to set up standard operating procedures that focus on these areas, and you'll need to train your staff on them. But staff aren't the only ones who need training to keep food safe. The FDA Food Code requires the person in charge of a food service operation, that's you, to become a certified food protection manager. That comes with a few requirements. First, you must be on site at all times during operating hours, and you have to show that you have the required knowledge. So, how can you show that? That's right. But accredited by whom? Well, it has to be an agency approved by a Conference for Food Protection. Here's the good news. Completing the ServSafe Manager course and passing the ServSafe Food Protection Manager certification exam meets this requirement. But why is it so important to be certified in food safety? Well, you're half right. A study by the CDC suggests that the presence of a certified food protection manager actually does reduce the risk of a foodborne illness outbreak. But according to studies by the FDA, the presence of a certified manager is also linked to more effective control of certain risk factors, like poor personal hygiene in different types of operations.
You already know that, as a manager, it's not enough to understand and implement good food safety practices. You also have to train your staff on how to keep food safe. Staff should be trained when they're first hired, but that's not the end of it. Ongoing training is critical too. Now, we know that all of your staff need general food safety knowledge. Everyone needs to know the correct way to wash their hands, right? But some of your staff will also need additional training specific to the tasks they do as part of their job. An example would be that only the receiving staff need to know how to inspect produce during receiving. Whether it's the basics of food safety or job-specific stuff, staff need to be retrained on food safety knowledge regularly. And when a food handler has completed training, make sure you document it. Then monitor them to make sure they're following procedures. Nobody is perfect, and sometimes you may notice employees doing tasks incorrectly. Each incorrect task could lead to an increase in risk. So, when this happens, it's important to correct the situation immediately. This is called corrective action. If you see employees doing tasks incorrectly, then they should be retrained. You want to keep your guests safe from foodborne illness, and you're not alone. There are a lot of government agencies that help keep food safe. The Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, aka the USDA, and your state and local regulators are just a few. Plus, there's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, and the U.S. Public Health Service, or PHS. Each one has a different role in keeping food safe. I got a question for you. Have you ever heard of the FDA Food Code? Don't worry, this is new information for a lot of people. Let's take a look at some of the details. The FDA is an important agency for food safety. For starters, the FDA inspects all food except for meat, poultry, and eggs. Plus, they regulate food that's transported across state lines, and they also issue the FDA Food Code. The Food Code is a science-based code that provides recommendations for food safety regulations. Did you ever wonder where things like required minimum internal cooking temperatures for meat come from? Well, most likely from the Food Code. The Food Code was created for city, county, state, and tribal agencies. These are the agencies that regulate food service for places like restaurants, retail food stores, and vending operations, in addition to schools, daycare centers, hospitals, and nursing homes. Now, while the FDA recommends that states adopt the Food Code, they can't require it. That's up to the state or local agency. The FDA also provides technical support and training for industry and regulatory agencies. Let's look at some other agencies. Who do you think is responsible for inspecting meat, poultry, and eggs? That's right. It's the USDA. They inspect meat, poultry, and eggs. And the USDA also regulates food that crosses state boundaries or involves more than one state. Okay, try another one. Who conducts research into the causes of foodborne illness outbreaks? Correct. It's the CDC. The CDC, along with the U.S. Public Health Service, assists the FDA, the USDA, and state and local health departments. It's the CDC and PHS who conduct research into the causes of foodborne illness outbreaks. and they also assist in investigating outbreaks. Last one. Which group writes or adopts codes that regulate retail and food service operations? You're absolutely right. It's the state and local regulatory authorities. Let's look at some of the details. State and local regulatory authorities write or adopt codes that regulate retail food service operations such as restaurants. Now, these codes may differ from the FDA Food Code because these agencies are not required to adopt it. State and local regulatory authorities have a wide range of food safety responsibilities. For one thing, they inspect operations and enforce regulations, and they investigate complaints and illnesses. They're also responsible for issuing licenses and permits, approving construction, and reviewing and approving HACCP plans. Okay, that's a lot to remember, but I've got some good news. We're just about done with this module. All you have to do is answer some review questions. Here's your chance to see if all of that information stuck.
That's right. A foodborne illness outbreak is confirmed when 2 or more people have the same symptoms after eating the same food. An investigation is conducted by state and local regulatory authorities, and the outbreak is confirmed by a laboratory analysis. A piece of glass found in a beverage is an example of which type of hazard? You got it. A piece of glass in a beverage or in food is a physical hazard. Things like metal staples and bones are other examples. A pan of chicken wings left out on a prep table for 7 hours is an example of which type of hazard? Absolutely right. Food has been time temperature abused when it has stayed too long at temperatures that are good for pathogen growth. Why are preschool-aged children at a higher risk for foodborne illnesses? That's right. Preschool-aged children have not yet built up strong immune systems. This leaves them at increased risk for foodborne illnesses. When must staff be trained in food safety? That's right. Staff should be trained when they are first hired, and then on an ongoing basis. Which organization issues the food code? You're absolutely right. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, issues the FDA Food Code. Excellent work.